Okay, let's try and wrap our heads around a massive global puzzle. Think about it for a second. Every single country on Earth is in debt. The United States, the European Union, Japan, China, seriously, you name it, they all owe these absolutely astronomical sums of money. So that leads to a pretty strange question, right? It's the central paradox we're going to unravel today. If everybody owes money, who exactly is the creditor? I mean, who gets paid? Where is all this money supposed to be flowing? Just look at that number. That's the total world debt today. It's so large, it's actually almost 3 times the size of the entire global economy. It's like a giant mountain of promises, an entire architecture of IOUs that holds up pretty much everything, from our governments all the way down to our personal savings. So how in the world did we get here? Well, to figure that out, we need to go back in time. Back to a moment when debt wasn't seen as a burden, but as a truly revolutionary idea. A time when a kingdom was flat broke and needed a brand new way to fund a war.
Believe it or not, this whole idea was born from conflict. Back in 1694, England needed money to fight a war with France. But instead of just taking money from its citizens, it did something new. It asked wealthy merchants for loans and, in return, promised to pay them back with interest guaranteed by future taxes. This created the very first government bonds. And the idea was so powerful that the brand new United States used the exact same playbook to finance its own war for independence.
And that, right there, was the brilliant invention, the government bond. It meant that for the first time, a state could spend money it didn't actually have yet. But here's the real kicker. It turned the government's promise into a tradable asset, a piece of paper that basically represented trust in the future of the nation itself. Okay, so let's fast forward to today's system and see how this idea has evolved. And there's no better way to do that than by looking at the biggest borrower on the planet, the United States. They've taken this concept and scaled it up to a level that the original creators could never have even dreamed of. Now, this is where things get really interesting because this right here busts a very common myth. You often hear that the U.S. is massively in debt to countries like China, but the reality is that a full 2/3 of its public debt is held right at home. It's owed to American investors, to pension funds, and even to its own central bank, the Federal Reserve. So the whole system works kind of like a circular mirror. Think of it this way. Taxpayers pay the government. The government uses that money to pay interest on its bonds, and a huge chunk of that interest flows right back into the pension funds and retirement accounts of those exact same taxpayers. So in a weird way, the country largely owes money to itself. And you know what? This circular logic, it's not just an American thing. It's pretty much the foundation for the entire global financial web. You've got Japan lending to the US lending to Europe, Europe lending to developing nations. It's just this vast, interconnected network of promises. It's been described as a giant poker game where everybody is playing with borrowed chips. The US has chips from Japan, Japan has chips from Europe, and on it goes. The game only keeps going because everyone agrees to keep playing, to trust that the chips they're holding actually have value. But here's the catch. Not everyone pays the same price to play this game. Wealthy, developed nations can borrow money at incredibly low interest rates. We're talking around 1%. But developing nations, they often face way higher costs, sometimes over 6.5%, just to get a seat at the table. And that difference has a staggering human cost. More than 3 billion people live in countries that are forced to spend more money on interest payments than they do on things like education or healthcare. So for them, debt isn't some abstract number on a screen. It's a very real barrier to progress that shapes the fate of their nations. So who manages this incredibly complex and, let's be honest, fragile system? Who decides who gets to survive and who struggles? Who are the poker dealers in this massive global game? Well, at the very center of it all, you'll find the central banks. Institutions like the U.S. Federal Reserve or the European Central Bank. They are the architects and the guardians of this debt-based world. And they hold immense power over the fate of entire nations. This is wild. They don't just manage debt. They literally create money. Here's how it works in a nutshell. The government issues bonds. Commercial banks buy those bonds. Then the central bank steps in and buys the bonds from the commercial banks. And to do that, it simply credits the bank's accounts with new digital money. That's it. New money has just been created out of thin air and injected into the financial system. And this whole process leads to a really profound, kind of mind-bending realization. There is no such thing as debt-free money in our system. Every single dollar, every euro, every yen in your pocket only exists because someone, somewhere went into debt. In our world, money is debt. So all of this builds to what is probably the most uncomfortable, maybe even shocking, truth about how this whole system is really designed to work. It's a truth that runs completely counter to everything we're taught about balancing our own budgets at home. And here it is. This is the core truth of the whole system. The debt, it isn't actually designed to ever be paid off. In fact, the system basically requires that the debt continues to exist forever. The machine needs it as fuel. So instead of paying down the principal, governments just roll it over. When an old bond is due, they simply issue a new bond to pay for it. It's kind of like a perpetual subscription service, where the real product isn't the loan itself, but that steady, reliable stream of interest payments. But that entire machine, that whole subscription model, it relies on one single critical ingredient: belief. The belief that the government will always be able to make its interest payments. So what happens when that belief suddenly vanishes? Well, we don't have to guess what happens. History gives us some pretty sobering examples. In Greece, it led to years of painful austerity. For Argentina, it has meant a devastating cycle of economic defaults. And just recently in Sri Lanka, it led to a total political and economic collapse. When confidence fades, the game just stops. And this brings us to the final and maybe the most bizarre irony in this whole story. If a country like the United States somehow actually managed to pay off all of its debt, it would be a complete catastrophe. Since money is created from debt, paying off that debt would suck all that money out of the system, shrinking the money supply and triggering a devastating economic collapse. So it leaves us with this fundamental question about the very foundation our world is built on. Is this system of perpetual rolling debt a brilliant invention that's funded centuries of progress? Or is it an incredibly fragile house of cards built on nothing more than a shared belief that it won't all come crashing down tomorrow?
Hey, welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're going to tackle a topic that's pretty much always in the headlines. A number so gigantic it feels unreal. Global debt. But we're going to push past the scary headlines and really get into what it is, how it actually works, and why the biggest secret to the whole thing is knowing it was never, ever meant to be paid back.
Okay, just let that sink in for a second. That sounds completely nuts, right? How can a system built on borrowing and lending possibly work if nobody ever actually settles the final bill? Well, that's the puzzle we're going to solve together.
So, for our first section, we have to completely flip the script on how you probably think about debt. I want you to forget the idea of debt as a burden, just for a moment, and let's look at how it actually props up our entire financial world.
At its most basic, fundamental level, money itself is a form of debt. It's a social promise. It's an IOU. When a government issues a bond, it's just creating a very official IOU. But here's the thing. This isn't just any old promise. It's considered the safest, most trustworthy financial instrument on the planet.
And this is the critical contrast you have to understand. We all think of our own debt, our credit card, our mortgage, as something we absolutely have to pay off. But on a global scale, government debt is the bedrock of the whole system. Pension funds, huge banks, even other countries, they all hold this debt as their safest asset. So here's the paradox. If governments actually did pay it all off, the entire system would lose its foundation. Our stability is literally built on this mountain of debt that never goes away.
But this foundation isn't exactly level. In fact, it's got some pretty deep cracks in it. And if you look closely at those cracks, they tell a story about where all this money really flows, and more importantly, who really benefits.
Just think about it for a second. When a government pays interest on its bonds, who's actually cashing that check? It's the people and the big institutions that bought the bonds in the first place. We're talking pension funds, massive banks, and very wealthy investors. So what this creates is a quiet, systematic transfer of wealth from the general public, the taxpayers, up to the asset-owning class. It's no coincidence that global debt and global inequality often seem to rise hand in hand.
And wow, this chart just lays the disparity bare. For more than 60 developing nations, just the interest payments eat up more than 10% of all government revenue. Can you imagine that? 1 out of every $10 the government collects is immediately shipped out to creditors, instead of going to things like healthcare, education, or adapting to climate change. Meanwhile, wealthy nations get to borrow money way more cheaply. It's a deeply unbalanced system. And here is the absolute kicker, the ultimate irony. While the Global South is drowning in financial debt, some reports estimate that wealthy nations owe them a staggering $107 trillion in what you could call climate debt for all their historical emissions. So the system demands financial interest payments from the Global South, while they are, in another very real sense, the world's biggest creditor.
Okay, so how does this all keep going? Well, it's all part of a huge, self-sustaining circle of money that connects every single one of us, whether we know it or not.
It really works like this. Governments need to spend money, so they issue bonds. Then financial institutions, and this includes the fund that manages your own retirement savings, they buy those bonds. They get paid interest on them, and what do they do with all that new money? Well, very often they just turn around and buy even more bonds. It creates this closed loop where we, as citizens, are weirdly on both sides of the equation, where the lenders and the borrowers at the same time.
And this loop is not just a domestic thing. It's completely global. Take the U.S., for instance. Sure, about 70% of its debt is held by Americans and American institutions, but major global players like Japan and China are also massive creditors. And this creates this incredibly deep financial interdependence. A tiny decision about interest rates made in Washington, D.C. can send absolute shockwaves through the financial markets in Beijing and Tokyo.
Now, this entire loop only works because of one crucial, completely invisible ingredient: trust. But what happens when that trust just evaporates? What happens when the whole machine grinds to a halt? The Greek crisis is just a brutal reminder of what that looks like. In 2009, everything seemed more or less fine. Then, almost overnight, investors lost confidence. The interest rates Greece had to pay just to borrow money went through the roof. And that triggered this devastating downward spiral, leading to incredibly painful cuts in public services, what's called austerity, and an unemployment rate that peaked at over 25%. The human cost was just immense.
And a crisis like that reveals where the power really is. All of a sudden, the decisions that affect millions of people's lives aren't being made by their elected governments anymore. They're being made by credit rating agencies that can cripple a country with a single downgrade, by institutions like the IMF that demand brutal conditions for their loans, and by thousands of anonymous bondholders all over the world who just have to decide whether to click sell or hold.
So with all this risk just baked into the system, it really begs the question, why hasn't the whole thing just imploded by now? The answer is that there's a powerful, almost invisible force working behind the scenes. You can think of it like a ghost in the machine, and its entire job is to manufacture trust.
And that force? It's the world's central banks. When panic starts to set in and investors are dumping government bonds, central banks step into the chaos. They become the buyer of last resort, using their incredible financial firepower to buy up massive amounts of these bonds, basically signaling to everyone, hey, calm down, everything is under control. It's all about keeping those interest rates low.
The main tool they use for this is something called quantitative easing, or just QE. After the 2008 financial crisis, this policy went totally mainstream. What it means, in simple terms, is that central banks create new money, basically out of thin air, and use it to buy up government debt. It's an incredibly powerful move that definitely calms markets, but it also fundamentally blurs the line between government debt and money itself.
And that brings us to our final section. This is where we connect all the dots and get to the core, fundamental truth of this global debt machine.
So here it is, the answer to the puzzle we started with. The system isn't designed for the debt to be repaid. It is designed to be rolled over, refinanced, and managed forever. The entire global financial structure, from your pension to international trade, it all depends on the collective belief, the shared confidence, that governments will always make their interest payments. The actual principle? It's almost beside the point.
And this, right here, is why this all matters to you. Getting your head around this concept isn't just some abstract economic exercise. It's a form of financial self-defense. It gives you the power to understand the real stakes when politicians are arguing about budgets and spending. It lets you hold them accountable for how they use this powerful, invisible architecture that shapes all of our lives.
At the end of the day, that's all this system of debt really is. A social contract. A set of promises between a government, its people, and the rest of the world. It can be used to fund wars, or it can be used to build hospitals and schools and create a sustainable future. Knowing how it works is the first step. The next is asking yourself, what are the terms of the contract